In Chapter 8, we will put everything we've learned so far into creating a web application. Objectives. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to use external files, use the constant data type, understand built-in date and time functions, use the same page to display and handle an HTML form, and make forms sticky. Creating templates. As you begin to create websites that contain multiple files, you'll notice that there are common elements that repeat across many pages. Copying the same code from page to page can become a challenge. It will be more difficult to make all of the pages the same, especially when something changes. You would have to change every page that contains those elements. To avoid this, you can create templates. Templates contain the common elements that would have been repeated on several pages. Examples of common elements would be headers, footers, and navigation. You code these in one place in a template and then reuse them on many other pages. To create a template, you start with an actual web page or a prototype of a web page. The starting web page should include the elements that you would like to reuse on the web pages on your website. These repeating elements will become the reusable templates that are included into the other web pages. To create the layout model, the image on the slide shows a prototype of the basic format for each page on a website. The HTML code for this page is in script 8.1. You might notice by looking at the image or by looking at the code that common elements will repeat on all pages. For example, the logo and the navigation at the top of the page and the footer at the bottom of the page. These are the common elements that we will split out into header and footer templates that will be reused on all of the pages on the website. To create the header and footer files, start with the template.html file for the prototype page, script 8.1. Copy the code from the top portion of the template.html file and save it in a new file called header.html. This is the header template. The code can be found in script 8.2. Copy the code from the bottom portion of the template.html file and save it in a new file called footer.html. This is the footer template. The code can be found in script 8.3. Now you have a header and footer template. We will learn how to use these shortly. Using external files. Now that we have the header and footer templates separated into their own files, we need a way to include them into the other web pages on the website. PHP has two functions for this, the include function and the require function. Both functions include a file in the same way, but they differ in how they handle errors. The include function will attempt to include a file and will continue if the file does not exist. The require function will attempt to include a file, but will not continue if the file does not exist. In this case, the entire PHP script will stop executing. As examples, you might see the code require header.html or include footer.html as shown on the slide. Visit the link at the bottom of the slide for additional information. When you include a file, it makes the included file's content as if it is part of the parent file. It's just as if you copied and pasted the content of the include file into the parent file. Any HTML or PHP code in the include file becomes part of the parent file. To use external files, The example code is taken from the index.php file script 8.4. Notice the include function at the beginning of the script to include the header.html file, and the include function at the end of the script to include the footer.html file. The code from the header and the footer files are inserted into the parent index.php file. Also notice that since include is a PHP function, it must be inside the PHP tags, just like any other PHP commands. As we'll see later, you can use this technique to include other files into your PHP script. Using constants. Constants are like variables in that they have a name and a value, but they are unlike variables in that the value cannot be changed. The value is constant. Also, constants don't start with a $sign. The name is usually in all uppercase. Use the define function to create a constant. We'll look at the code example on the slide. We use the define function to create two constants, pi and currency. Then we print the values of the constants. Try the code in PHP Fiddle. Printing constants is not the same as printing variables. Including the constant name in a string prints the name and not the value. When printing, either concatenate the constant or use a separate print statement. Look at the print statements on the slide for examples. You can also check to see if a constant exists by using the defined function. It returns true if the constant exists. To use constants, look at the code examples on the slide. The first example is taken from the books.php file script 8.5. It defines the title constant and sets the value to the title for the page. Then it includes the header.html template file. The second example is taken from the header.html file script 8.6. It uses PHP to set the HTML title tag for the page. First, it checks to see if the title constant is defined. Since it was defined in the books.php file, this is true. So it prints the value that was previously defined for the title constant. If for some reason it wasn't defined, it would print a default title. You can see the full code example in the textbook. Working with date and time. PHP has several functions for working with date and time. The date function is just one of those. It returns a string in a specific date and time format. The first argument for the date function is the format to use for the date and time string. There are several options for formatting the date and time. Some of the most common are shown on the next slide. Look at the example on the slide. The date function prints the current date in the format specified. The lowercase l means the day of the week full name, like Thursday. The uppercase F means the month full name, like January. The lowercase j means the day in one or two digits, like 26. Then a comma. The uppercase Y means the year in 4 digits, like 2017. Try the code in PHP Fiddle. Try other formatting options from the next slide. For example, replace the J with a lowercase d and replace the uppercase Y with a lowercase y. The lowercase d shows the day in 2 digits, and the lowercase y shows the year in 2 digits. If the current day is 2 digits, then you won't see any difference. If the current day is 1 digit, then you should see 2 digits with a leading 0. And you should see a 2-digit year. Visit the link at the bottom of the slide for additional information. Here are some of the most common options for formatting date and time. You can see all of the formatting options that we used in the previous example. Table 8.1 in the textbook has a more complete list of date formatting options. Many of the date and time functions use a value of timestamp. A timestamp is the number of seconds since midnight on January 1st, 1970. The date, January 1st, 1970, is known as epoch. Two common functions for creating timestamps are time and makeTime. The time function returns a timestamp for the current date and time, and the makeTime function returns a timestamp for a particular date and time. For example, look at the code on the slide. The timestamp for epoch is 0, and the timestamp for February 14th, 2020 is 1,581,638,400. Run the code in PHP Fiddle. Make sure to include the first function that sets the time zone to UTC. We will discuss this on the next slide. The date and times in PHP are based on the time zone. The server's time zone should be set in the PHP configuration file on the server. It can also be set in the PHP code using the date default time zone set function. You saw this in the example on the previous slide. In that case, we set the time zone to UTC, which is equivalent to Greenwich Mean Time. We did this so the makeTime function wouldn't adjust for the local time zone, which could cause the epoch timestamp to be something other than 0. When working with time zones, consider the following. The server's time zone may be set to UTC or Greenwich Mean Time. The server's time zone may be set to the time zone where the server is located. Or the server's time zone may be set to a time zone of another location. Each of these will create different date and time values. Also consider that the time zone on the user's computer might be different than all of these. You will need to use JavaScript if you need to get the time zone from the user's computer. To use the date function, The example code is taken from the footer.html file script 8.7. It uses the date function to include the current date and time in the page footer. First, set the time zone to America, New York, which is the Eastern time zone. This will cause all date and times to adjust to the Eastern time zone. Then call the date function to get the current date and time. Use the formatting parameters from table 8.1 to format the way the date is displayed. This format string will display the date in the format shown in the footer image on the slide. Handling HTML forms with PHP Revisited. So far we used two separate files to handle HTML forms. One file to display the form, and the other to handle the form action and process the form data. Another option is to use one file where we put the form and the form processing in the same file. For this to work, we need to include a condition to determine when the form is submitted. That way we only process the form data after the form is submitted. There are several ways to determine when a form is submitted. You could use the isSet function to check whether any form field has a value. In this case, you run the risk of the form being submitted without setting a value for the field that you're checking. Or you could create a hidden field with a value. Then use the isSet function to check whether that field has a value. This is a better choice because the hidden field will always be set to the value when the form is submitted. Another way to determine if the form was submitted is to check if the server request method equals post. For this to work, the method attribute on the HTML form tag must be set to post. The server array contains information about the server and the request. It contains an index named request method with the value of the method used to submit the form, either get or post. So we check to see if the value is post to determine if the form was submitted. Run the try it yourself example on the link at the bottom of the slide. It uses this method as well. To use one page to display and handle a form. The example code is taken from the login.php file script 8.8. First, it determines if the form was submitted by checking if the server request method equals post. If this is true, then the form was submitted and we handle the form input. In this case, we check the login values and continue with the login process. If not, the form was not submitted, so we display the form. Notice in the form tag that the method is set to post. Simply put, if the form was not submitted, then display the form. If the form was submitted, then process the input. Making forms sticky. Sticky forms mean that the form fields remember the values that were entered. In PHP, this means that we set the value of the form field back to the value that was previously entered. Remember, in HTML, that form fields have several attributes. For example, the type and the name. They also have a value attribute. In HTML, you would set this when you want the field to have a default value. Otherwise, it doesn't have a value until the user types something into that field. Then, the value only exists when the form is submitted. The form field values are reset when the form is displayed the next time. To make the field sticky, we capture the value entered, then use PHP to set the value in the HTML form field. Look at the example on the slide. You see the value attribute on the HTML input tag. Inside the value attribute is PHP code to print the value of the first name element from the post array. This is the value the user entered on the form when it was submitted. Check out script 8.9 in the textbook for an example of sticky forms. In the form code at the end of the file, you can see where the values of first name, last name, and email are being set to the values in the post array from the previous submit. Setting the values to the values that were previously submitted makes the form sticky. A couple of notes when using sticky forms. First, check to see if a variable exists before using it in your code. For example, the code on the previous slides would cause an error if first name did not exist in the post array. Printing a variable that doesn't exist creates an error. Second, be careful when using any values entered on a form. Certain characters can cause problems when printed. Use the HTML special characters function to prevent this. The code example on the slide shows how to implement both of these. When setting the value, first, use the isSet function to check to see if the item exists in the post array. Then, when printing, use the HTML special characters function to handle special characters. Sending email. Use the mail function to send email. The to parameter is the email address to send to. The subject parameter is the subject of the email, and the body parameter is the email message to send. For the mail function to work, it requires an installed and configured email server. Your company may already have an email server, or you could use a hosted email service. Setting up your own email server is a bit more challenging. If you're interested in setting up your own email server, review the Configuring Your Server to Send Emails section in the textbook. Also, check out script 8.10 in the textbook and the link at the bottom of the slide for examples of sending email. Output buffering. There are a few functions in PHP that must be called before any output is sent to the browser. Functions like header, setCookie, and session start. Calling these after sending anything to the browser will cause a header already sent error. We will cover these functions in this chapter and the next. For now, you just need to remember that some PHP functions require special considerations. To avoid this error, you could use output buffering. Normally, any PHP print code or anything outside the PHP tags is sent to the browser immediately. This includes any text, even spaces, or HTML, or any PHP print statements. When using output buffering, the output is placed in a memory buffer before being sent to the browser. At the end of the script, the buffer is sent to the browser, or the buffer can be cleared before sending. Holding the output in a buffer and sending it to the browser after calling the special PHP functions will help to avoid the headers already sent errors. To use output buffering, start with the OB start function. Put this at the top of your script. It will send all output to a memory buffer instead of directly to the browser. Since no output has been sent, you can call functions like header and setCookie without getting the header already sent error. These functions execute normally. Only the output is being held for later. At the end of the script, call the obEndFlush function to send the buffer to the browser, or call the obEndClean function to delete the buffer without sending it to the browser. By the way, it is common to call the header and setCookie functions without using output buffering. You just have to be more careful and not send any output before calling them. To use output buffering, the example code is taken from the header.html file script 8.11. To start output buffering, include the obStart function at the top of the header file. The function must be called before any output is sent to the browser. In other words, before any print statements, HTML, or any other page content. In the sample code, you can see that it is the first thing in the script. Since the header file is included at the beginning of every page, output buffering will be turned on for every page in the application. The example code is taken from the footer.html file script 8.12. To end output buffering, include the obEndFlush function at the end of the footer file. Calling this function turns off output buffering and sends the buffer to the browser. Any output that has been accumulating in the buffer will be sent to the browser. This includes any print statements, HTML, or any other content to display on the page. And since the footer file is included at the end of every page, output buffering will be handled at the end of every page in the application. Manipulating HTTP headers. Use the header function to communicate HTTP header information to the client. It sets the header information for the response from the web server back to the web browser. One of the most common uses for the header function is to redirect the user from one page to another. To redirect the browser, you send a location header. Look at the example on the slide. You see the header function takes a location parameter. The first part of the parameter must be exactly as you see it, location : The second part is the name of the page to redirect to. In this case, it is page.php. When you execute this command in a PHP script, the page.php file will be displayed. It is a good practice to call the exit function after redirecting the page. This stops the execution of the PHP script on the current page. Otherwise, the current page will continue to execute even though the user has been redirected to another page. Remember that the header function must be called before any other output is sent to the browser. If not, you will receive the headers already sent error message. This is a case where you could use output buffering to store any output before redirecting the page. To use the header function, the example code is taken from the login.php file script 8.13. This is the part of the code where the user logs in with the correct email and password. If the login is successful, Clear out the current buffer. Use the header function to redirect the user to the welcome.php page, and call the exit function to stop the login.php script. Look in the textbook at script 8.13 for the full script code.